Let's go. SUSE QE Tools Workshop for today will be led by Marius Hitler about the topic of multi-machine tests. For that, we have some new interesting features and also something to look out for the future, and also improved existing tooling. So, Marius, what can you tell us?
Yes, the concrete topic was actually triggering multiple openQA jobs with the jobs post route. So that's what it's going to be about. I have prepared an Etherpad which I can link here. It contains links to the main most important documentation pages. So I will shortly show you what's relevant here. Of course, the page about triggering tests. And then, of course, the page about job dependencies, especially if you are not so sure when you read, for instance, the help text of openQA clone job, what these terms mean. This section is very important because it explains certain things, but I will also go in a concrete example later into these, so I won't go into this documentation itself right now. So that's basically the documentation. If you haven't looked at it for quite a while, we only recently improved it, so it makes sense to revisit it. And like the topic says, this is about triggering multiple openQA jobs with the jobs post route. Of course, so far, if you want to trigger multiple jobs, you can do this using the ICE posts route.
That is what always worked. Yeah.
Right. So that's of course also explained here in the documentation. And it works, and it also works if you have dependencies between these jobs you want to spawn. That's actually the whole point of the talk, because the dependencies is where you would run into problems if you use the normal jobs post route, at least so far. But we recently improved it so you wouldn't run into problems anymore. But first, I want to say what kind of problems you would actually expect. If you spawn multiple jobs which depend on each other using jobs post, and you use one API call for each job, you would run into problems with jobs having parallel dependencies, multi-machine jobs, or with jobs which have directly chained dependencies, because then the scheduler will see the first few jobs you have spawned before you could actually spawn all of them, and maybe half schedule a parallel cluster. Yeah, so that's of course not so nice, and it
So
would
with,
be
with half schedule, you mean some are scheduled, some are not yet, and it doesn't really
yes,
form a real thing.
I mean, it would already see, let's say, the first two jobs which you have created and assign them to a worker, but you actually would then create another two jobs, and they wouldn't be considered in the first round of job assignment to workers, and only considered later, but that's not so ideal actually. Yeah, so, and of course, the directly chained dependencies have a whole different problem, because they need to be assigned at the very same time to one worker to have it work internally. And that's only possible if the scheduler sees all the jobs at the same time. Okay, so we improved that by allowing you to spawn multiple jobs using one jobs post API call, and that will then be atomic. So the scheduler only sees the full set of new jobs. And I added an example here in the documentation. So instead of only specifying the keys, you would also specify a colon and then some freely chosen ID. And then, of course, the value as usual. And you can choose multiple IDs here. And the number of different IDs basically determines the number of different jobs which will be spawned. And if two assignments like this one and this one should go, if two assignments like that one and that one should go into one job, they need to use the same identifier. So here we spawn two jobs, and the first job has the test setting first job, and the second job has the test setting second job. And here we also have the setting start after for the second job, and the value is 0, which is actually the ID we used for the first job. So that means the second job will only start after the first job. So it's the chained dependency, if you already know the different dependency types. And if you wanted to use a different dependency type, you could use, instead of start after, parallel or start directly after. And you can, of course, also use a colon and multiple identifiers here. Okay, somebody would like to speak.
Felix?
So
Yeah, Marius, two questions here. The start after typically requires the full job name. When you say that start after double point 1 equals 0, is it automatically expanded into the full job name of the first job?
no. This is different than what you have seen elsewhere. So elsewhere, we already have two different ways of specifying a job dependency. In the jobs post way, you would have usually in a test suite a setting, and I think it's not even called start after. I think it's start after test equals, and then some test name. That's what you were referring to. And because it's start after test, you need to specify the name of the test suite.
Yeah,
And
so start after test, the name of the test variable, this name test is refers to the test suite. We use the name test as kind of a shortcut for test suite. Yeah. So it would be a different thing. That's correct. That's start after test without the leading underscore. That would be used to reference one test suite from another. Here, this is, of course, we are using start after as the same word because it has the same meaning, but it takes a different thing.
Yeah, so that what you meant is basically the ISUS post world, which I won't go into much today.
Yeah, that still all works. So this is unchanged. What we are talking
Right.
about here is additional stuff without breaking any of the existing ways.
Yeah, thank you. Second question, if you pass normal parameters here, like, I don't know, schedule equals test 1, 2, 3 without the double point 0, 1, is this then passed to all of the jobs?
No, it will be passed to one of them, which has the identifier empty string.
Okay, so if you decide to put identifiers, you need to be explicit with the identifiers.
Yes, you need to use them everywhere.
Thank you. Yeah.
But it's not so big of a deal, I hope. Since you already mentioned it, I can continue at this point. For instance, you can see here an example where identifiers are not used, at least not for the first setting. But then someone wants to have a key which has actual columns in it. To solve this problem, you would simply end with a trailing column, and that's actually identical to having no colon in the case where you really have no colon at all in the key. So that's the empty identifier case. Yeah. So yeah, and here the 0 really refers to the identifier 0 you specified here. It's not a job ID, and it doesn't even have to be a number. It can be anything. And it won't matter after all what you have chosen here. Only in the response it will show up again, because as you can see here, we have 0 and then some job ID. So 0 ended up as this job and 1 ended up as this job. Yes, that's what you will get. And I think that's actually all of it. It's really not more complicated, but usually you won't use that directly. You likely use the openQA clone job script most of the time. And the good news is that openQA clone job will now use the new API and will therefore also spawn jobs atomically. So everything should work as expected regarding these race conditions I mentioned before. And of course, the clone job script already takes this into account and uses the new output format. And the clone job script, for instance, simply puts the old job ID here as identifier because it was the easiest way to implement it. Yeah, so let me have a look. Yeah, right. So now I want to do some remarks about openQA clone job because I think it's kind of important to know what it does when it comes to dependency handling. I already covered the first point, but there's another catch. And I really say it because I got some feedback for this problem already. You really need to have an up-to-date openQA clone job script and an up-to-date web UI. So both sides need to be updated for this to work. And yes, the version we have currently in lib is not new enough. So you need to use our devil repositories. If you use a too old web UI, but a new clone script, it won't even work at all. You will get an error message. But of course, OSD and O3 are already up to date.
Yeah, if you're using Tumbleweed, then of course it's also fine.
Yes. And of course, if you use our devil repositories for lib. There were some other changes in openQA clone job, which are hopefully an improvement. It now clones parallel children by default. What I mean by that exactly, I will go into using an example. It also now supports max depth to clone, to limit the clone depth of children. By default, only direct children are cloned. And you can really just check out the help text of openQA clone job for further details. But now I will show you some examples and also explain some terminology in this example. So you will hopefully then better understand the help texts and documentation. Yeah, for that I simply looked at OSD and I just opened some random job with a dependency tree. I hope this tree is simple enough not to confuse you, but also complicated enough to show some problems. For instance, the question is, usually the question is, if you clone, for instance, that job, what other dependent jobs will be cloned? If you use the openQA clone job script, you will normally, I think there's no other way. You can only specify one single job, and you can only influence with certain parameters what other jobs in the dependency tree will be cloned as well. So the first question is, for instance, what happens if you simply clone this root job here with default settings? Well, you will actually only end up with this one job being cloned and no further dependencies. So it will look like that. You won't have a dependency tab here because it's just a single job after all. That's because we don't clone children by default. And so that's the first rule we can discover by that. So what would happen if I now clone this job at the top? You can see it has an arrow from the first job to this job, which means it is a chained dependency. And chained means that job will run after the first job, and chained is a so-called dependency type. So that's what the documentation refers to in the first sentence. There are also other dependency types, for instance, parallel. These are the blue boxes here. And directly after test, that's the directly chained dependency. I'm not going into details here right now. It would look like the same in the test, except that the start after test here is then start directly after test.
Marius should notice we can't see your mouse cursor, so if you mark text, then we can see what you highlighted.
Yes, I hope I marked text in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I'm also hovering about it, so you should see the tooltip.
Yeah, right, we do.
Right, good. And by the way, just because it was mentioned earlier, here you see start after test, but that doesn't necessarily mean the job has been created using this specific specification. It could be that you have used start after. It's just displayed this way in the web UI. Okay, so now I hopefully covered dependency types. And of course, you see that the arrows here are directed, so they point from one to each other. And the one at the source is the parent job, and one at the destination of the arrow is the child job. And you can also distinguish that by the tooltip here. The tooltip has the specification, and that means it's the child. The job with the specification is always the child. That's also true for these kind of specifications. You always have it on the child. Okay, so that's the second thing to consider, that we have a parent and a child. And that's true also for parallel jobs. So the two jobs here in this blue box also have this property. The first one here at the top is the parent, and the second one is the child. And I found that out in the same way as for the chained dependency. Here the one with the specification, in this case parallel with, is the child, and the one at the top has no specification, at least not for the parallel dependency, so it is the parent. Okay, so now that we have clarified that, a few more things about cloning. For instance, what would happen if we clone this job at the very top? We know it's a chained child, and we know it's a parallel parent. So if we would clone this job, we would also clone its chained parent, because we clone parent jobs by default with clone job. And we would also clone its child, its parallel child. And that's because we have a rule which says we also clone parallel children in contrast to chained children. And we have this rule because it makes most sense. Usually you want to run all jobs in the parallel cluster and not just the parent. So if you would clone the job at the very top, it would look like that. Like I said, you would clone the parent and the child. And the child because it's a parallel child. So that's what you would do if you want to clone the blue box, basically. If you don't want to clone the chained parent, then you can specify minus minus skip depth. Then you would only have the blue box. Skip chained depth. Because if you would use skip depth, then you would really only have this very single job. Yeah, but skip chained depth is basically your go-to for losing the jobs chained before it, usually some create HDD jobs. That makes sense if you just want to download the HDD and only run the parallel jobs. We could, of course, also clone the second job here. That's the child, the parallel child. It makes not so much of a difference in this cluster, but if you have a bigger cluster which has more children, it would make a difference, because if you clone the parallel child, it would then clone the parallel parent, but not the other parallel siblings. So you would not end up cloning the whole cluster. That can, of course, also be useful sometimes when you only want to test one specific, let's say, node in this multi-machine scenario. Then you likely want the parent and only one specific node. So you have to consider which job you actually clone when you clone parallel jobs. That's also why I mentioned this parent and child relationship so explicitly, because it really matters when you want to clone a job. Okay, so now, of course, one question remains. What would you do if you want to clone all jobs? Meaning you want not only the first blue box, but also the second, third, and so on. Then the easiest way, I think, is to simply clone the first job and specify minus minus clone children. That would then also clone all the children. And of course, that means all blue boxes in this case. So you would end up with a replica like this. Yeah, so that's, I think, everything you need to know about cloning jobs. And okay, since we have a question, maybe I will just stop here and answer the question.
So my question, this clone children option, is it effectively the same as providing max depth is 1?
Sorry, what option did you mean?
So you just talked about clone children. is it
Yes.
effectively the same as max depth is 1?
No, it's not. Clone children is some binary flag whether to actually clone children or not. And if you enable it, then max depth has effect. And by default, it's 1. So if you say clone children, max depth default is effective. So that would only cover the first level of jobs. And you would need to specify some other value of max depth if you want to clone even further.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Yeah, I think you can also specify 0 for infinity. The only problem is that max depth is actually also about going up the chain. So it would also affect how to proceed from parents which are cloned. For instance, I mentioned at the beginning, if you clone the job here at the very top, you would also clone its parent. And if you use max depth, it basically also affects this in the sense that you would also now clone more siblings. So you maybe want to be careful, but usually you don't have graphs that makes a difference anyways. Okay, I also read the documentation suggestion. Maybe we can do that so it is clear that you don't need to use some magic number. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, any more questions?
I think the number is also fine if we state that this is maybe the suggested convention.
I would also say that's what usually makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't use more characters than you need to.
Yeah, because if you say ID 0, then I guess many people will assume that you need to write the literal ID, which is also not the case. So you
That
already
could be true.
picked the good example, just that you state one sentence, and then for the people that just copy paste the example and don't read the notice, it will still work.
Yeah, and of course here the sentence already says they are actually freely chosen and merely used to specify which parameters belong to which job.
Okay.
Okay, so do we have any further questions?
Yeah, there was a question in the chat by Richard Fan. Do we have a simple way to load the job settings as openQA does, where there are already many default settings, in the job templates when we trigger a job manually?
Yes, unfortunately not. So if you spawn a single job using jobs post, only the parameters you pass here will be parameters of the jobs. So in this case, it's very simplified and not very realistic because normally you want to have a few more parameters, like the worker class at least. Yeah, so that's not possible, but I'm also wondering where would it take the parameters from?
Yeah, so just to make clear what the different use cases are. So jobs post is really the most bare minimum example where you say you're not relying on any settings in openQA at all. And maybe in many use cases, products that use openQA can use this way without ever storing anything into openQA. And now with that, we are actually able to create clusters where you don't need to put any information into openQA before. So that's really a huge use case. If you already have information in openQA, then you can use openQA clone jobs, which also works for multi-machine tests, and you can use ISOs post. I understand that with ISOs post there's a big rather a big risk, because if you get it wrong and you have a product like the example that you show here, which is for SLE testing, where we have thousands of tests, and if you get something wrong, then you're actually like respawning thousands of tests, and then people will become confused and say like, hey, why is the complete build restarted or something? So that's certainly a limitation. There, it's better to use openQA clone job. And I assume that with the recent changes also covering openQA clone job, we should be okay for such use cases where you're relying on existing settings which are already in the instance, or in that case, in previous jobs. So Marius, can you confirm that with openQA clone job also using the new ways how we can rely on the existing job settings but tweak certain parameters? Like in this most simple instance, let's say I want to schedule Wicked Advanced Ref plus Wicked Advanced SUT into outside the job group.
Yes.
For testing purposes, and I want to add a suffix to both tests.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to go into as well. We also improved that about openQA clone job. So first of all, as we are talking about passing parameters within openQA clone job, one should be aware that parameters are not passed to parents. So if we clone this job and with default settings, we would also clone the parent. Then settings you specify with some exceptions are not automatically also set on the parent. So to make that happen, you need to specify -- parental inheritance. That's actually nothing new, but I just mentioned it in this context. And if you use that, then the settings you specify will be updated in all of the jobs. Of course, it can sometimes be useful to only append something, because, for instance, setting the test variable would be rather confusing. You actually can do it. Then all the jobs, for instance, if you clone this job, then all the jobs, like the child also and the parent also, would have the same test name.
Yeah, so instead of Wicked Advanced Ref and Wicked Advanced SUT, it would say something like test, or or mKittler or Kurz, what I commonly write there.
Yeah, whatever you used, it will be. And that is, of course, rather confusing. It will actually work in the sense that it will create the correct cluster. But of course, the test overview page will try to stack them, and it's useless.
It wasn't that big of a problem when, for example, for verification of test changes, when I was using that, then I just referenced the job by ID anyway. And in most cases, the client is more interesting than the parent. So, even if the parent would have the same name, we wouldn't care, because we can just say, here's the client with the ID, and the ID is fine, and the cluster was fine. And it had some custom name, and it didn't show up in some kind of product related dashboard, so it was okay. But of course now that I have much better control.
So now you can say test plus equals some suffix, and then all the test variables will change, but only append the suffix and honor whatever was before in the particular jobs. You can use the plus equals syntax in all kinds of parameters, but it's mostly useful for the test. Right, and just because Oliver mentioned it, if you wanted to spawn these or clone these jobs, but not within their original group, you would use underscore group equals 0. Of course, in this case, then you also want to use either a skip chained steps if you don't want the parent anyways, or parental inheritance. So all jobs will end up without a group. Yeah, so that's basically the story about openQA clone job. And of course, it can still be improved. For instance, if you want to have a setting only within a very specific job, there's so far no way to do it. Yeah, but that's not implemented yet. Okay, do we have any further questions? Okay.
I wonder about different use cases. Do you have something more on your agenda?
No, now that we also covered the plus equals syntax, I think I'm out of new improvements.
Right. So thank you. This is, I consider it quite a clear structure for, of course, which is a complicated topic. So this is why I also would like to point out that Marius also, with the help of others, improved and extended the documentation, not only for the new features, but also revisited what was there before, describing the concept and describing the different ways how to achieve the different use cases.
Yes, that's what I was mentioning at the beginning. So if you have read the job dependency section at some point, yeah, maybe it makes sense to revisit it, because it is now, I hope, much better.
Right. And but I guess we can maybe repeat so that it's really sinks in with people. What is the right tool for the different use cases? How would you describe that? Maybe we go from, let's say, the most simple, the most limited use case to the most complicated one, and which tool and which approach and in which feature to use.
Okay, if you want to simply clone some jobs which are already in production somewhere, it makes sense to use openQA clone job with the correct parameters and the correct job. Also, it will hopefully do the right thing by default without having to specify too many parameters.
So with the correct job, like for example, if I'm carrying, let's say Wicked Advanced SUSE, the second job from top that we see, would fail, and then we would like to try out by tweaking a certain parameter if it behaves any different when we change a certain setting. Let's say setting foobar, we want to put that to 1. With openQA clone job, I can just select that job, and in that case, I would be able to say skip chain steps, to say I don't need to restart the parent, which is creating this complete spider web. I just need the parallel reference, which runs in parallel when I spawn SUT. But when I do that, I add that foobar setting. I don't care if it's also added to ref, so I can just say foobar equals 1, right? But what about the name and the group so that it doesn't interfere with the product view?
Yes. So you would usually also use _group equals 0 and test plus equals some other suffix, and maybe you would also set the build.
Yep.
So setting the build to something unique is quite nice, because then you can have a test result overview page with only your newly spawned jobs. Of course, you can then also get rid of all the other parameters.
If it would be truly unique, like if it would say build ticket number 42 mKitler, then it would simply show the overview of just the 2 jobs that you're interested in, which is quite nice.
Yeah. By the way, another use case is of course simply restarting jobs. Restarting and cloning behaves similar if you think about dependencies, but not completely similar. I haven't covered restarting yet, but there's actually also a section in the documentation which explains to you which jobs will be restarted going from a certain job. And you can also use the arrow to skip parents, skip children, and skip restarting OK jobs past soft fail children. But there's actually even more in the REST API, I think, but it's all covered in the documentation. Yeah, so because restarting is also often a use case. Of course, if you want to spawn something more regularly, always the same set of multiple jobs, then it makes still sense to use the ISUS post route, but maybe not necessarily. I mean, jobs post has the problem that you have to specify many parameters, but if some script does it for you, it's likely also a good approach if you want to spawn jobs in an automated way. And it has the advantage that it really doesn't rely on any scheduling tables within openQA. So you don't have to care about adding a test suite, machines, and all the tables. You can just write your script which would invoke the jobs post route with all the parameters you need and be done with it. So
yeah, so putting everything into Git is a possibility if we are using that.
yes, I think that was also the approach which was wanted when Carwash came up. They had jobs using some dependencies, but I think Kulo, for simplicity, wanted to use still the post route. Yes, so I'm not sure what Oliver had in mind with other use cases. But yeah, if you like, you can ask more questions. If not, we can also conclude the meeting.
It's okay. Then let me just point out what's the, or actually you have the page open. So what will be the
Yes.
topic for next week?
Right. So today was triggering multiple openQA jobs with jobs post route. And next week we have the SUSE QE Tools roadmap. So that will be either led by me or by Chris. Yeah, so I think the topic name says it already.
Yep, that's the one that we do at the start of each month. It's just that I'm taking a day off, so yeah, Marius, you and Chris, you can handle that. Okay, guys, thank you all for attending. We still have some minutes, so yeah, we can actually hang around here. So if you're thinking of some further ideas or some questions regarding what we discussed here in a smaller group, then we can also do that. Until then, thank you and goodbye.